The Hunger Games is a futuristic novel, and it's set in what are the remains of North America. The main character is a 16-year-old girl named Katniss Everdeen who lives in a coal mining district called District 12. The country, Panem, is a central capital, which is the center of control, and it's surrounded by 12 districts which basically service its needs. Years ago, there was a rebellion of the districts because they live in poverty and felt they were being unfairly treated, and they waged a war against the capital, and they lost. And as part of those surrender terms, every year, each of the districts has to send one boy and one girl between the ages of 12 and 18 to compete in the Hunger Games. And this is a fight to the death in an arena. Probably the first inspiration from the Hunger Games came from the Greek myth of Theseus and the Minotaur. When I was a child, I was a fanatic about Greek mythology, and this was one of my favorite myths. In it, Minos, who is the king of Crete, has a falling out with Athens, basically. And Crete is a far more powerful country. And as part of punishment for Athens, every year, in part of the punishment, Athens has to send 7 youths and 7 maidens to Crete, where they are thrown into the labyrinth to be devoured by a monster called the Minotaur. And even when I was a little kid, this just stunned me because it was so cruel. It was the cruelest thing that he could think to do to the people of Athens. It's worse than killing them. He's killing their children. So I took this idea and incorporated it into the Hunger Games, and then in keeping with the classical background, I decided that the nature of the Hunger Games would be very much based on Roman gladiator games. In my mind, you need 3 good elements to make a gladiator game. You need a ruthless, all-powerful government. You need people being forced to fight to the death. And you need it to be a popular entertainment. And all 3 of these elements are combined in the Hunger Games. Also, within the book, you'll find a lot of references to ancient Rome. The name of the country itself is Panem, and that also is with the Roman theme. There will be very many other elements you'll find when you read it, from people's names to chariot rides to the actual nature of the gladiator games, which involve not only human-on-human combat, but things, for instance, like the initiation of wild animals into the ring. Well, some people did think Theseus was a real person, and of course the gladiator games were real, but there's another level to the Hunger Games which is much more contemporary, and that deals with our sort of fascination now with reality television. And you'll see a lot of aspects of that also because the games are televised across the country of Panem, and it is mandatory that you watch them because they are not only supposed to be entertainment, of course, they are the yearly reminder that the districts are being punished for having the audacity to rebel against the capital. The actual moment where I conceived of the idea of this particular story, I mean, I've told you the classical background, but it occurred one night. I was lying in bed and I was very tired, and I was just sort of channel surfing on television, and I was flipping through images of reality television where there were these young people competing for $1 million or a bachelor or whatever. And then I was flipping and I was seeing footage from the Iraq War. And these 2 things began to sort of fuse together in a very unsettling way. And that is when I think was the moment where I got the idea for Katniss's story. Watching war footage is a very powerful experience for me. I'm a military brat, and when I was a child, my father fought in Vietnam. He was career Air Force. And I can remember being very young, and my mother tried really hard to protect us, but occasionally, after afternoon cartoons or whatever was on, the TV would continue going on and the nightly news would come on, and I would see footage from the war zone. And I would hear the word Vietnam, and I would know my dad was over there, and it was a very frightening experience for me. And I'm sure that for many people who have loved ones over in Iraq or other experiences with having a loved one in war, have participated in one themselves, they have that reaction when they see the news coverage. But I get concerned that maybe a lot of people don't. We're so bombarded with imagery, and I worry that we're all getting a little desensitized to it. There's just too much of our lives that we're putting on television. And I think it's fine if you get desensitized to a sitcom or something like that. But when you're watching real footage, actual tragedy unfolding before you, that's different. It is real life, and it isn't going to go away when the commercial break comes on. I hope it does make people think about what they watch in a more reflective way. There are a lot of themes that run throughout the book, and different people who have read it so far seem to attach to different ones. And for some, it's like the idea of the violence and the reality TV and that sort of being desensitized to it. Other people seem to be very affected by the themes of hunger and food as a power tool that run throughout it. You know, other people seem to hone right in on the romance. So it's of all the things I've ever written, I don't think I've ever had a book or a television project that so much of the experience was dependent on the reader's own experience, and that's been really fun to hear the feedback on. I don't think it's a boy or girl book at all. It has a female lead, but she's strongly supported by several male protagonists. It's a story with a lot of action, a lot of violence because of the nature of the tale. And I think the balance of male-female characters is pretty strong throughout. Certainly. What I would have to say about that, though, is that the Gregor books were written for 9 to 12, and for these they're recommending them for 12 and above. And I think the difference there is that while there was a great deal of violence in Gregor, a lot of it was between humans and, you know, giant rats and bats and spiders, and it helped distance you a bit from it. In this book, it's not only human-on-human violence, but it's kid-on-kid violence. And I think that's why they've upped the age range on it. There's nothing in it that's particularly sexual. There's not a lot of profanity or anything like that. I think it has to do with the painfulness of the idea of children killing children. Yes, the deaths are hard to write, always, and the violence between the young characters are hard to write. But I think in this kind of story, like in the Gregor books, you have to commit to it. You're going to have young characters. They're going to be involved in violent situations. And you either make a decision up front that you're going to do that, and you're going to do it fully, no matter how painful or uncomfortable it is to write those scenes, or I think you should just go tell another kind of story. The book has so many dark passages that are emotionally difficult to write. So when you're done, you feel satisfied that you've finished them, but they're not in and of themselves particularly fun things to write. The more enjoyable passages are probably Katniss reflecting back on the past, stories that we hear either just when she's remembering them about how she met Gale, stories that she tells to Peeta about how she got the goat for her sister, because those are just happier moments for her, and so they were lighter to write. I do love the goat story because in that story you see her whole motivation. You see the relationship between the sisters. You see how Katniss really, in a way, has become Prim's parent and how important it is for her to bring her joy and happiness and the lengths that you'll go to do it. And I also like it because at that moment, Peta, who is the audience for that story, it is a point at which their friendship is beginning to blossom. Well, when I got the initial idea for the story, I was pretty focused on the material that just took place in the Hunger Games, the first book. But when I got to the conclusion of that, I knew that there had to be a sequel because something happens. One of the main characters does something that would never go unpunished. And I knew I would have to continue the tale after that. Initially, I briefly plotted out all 3 books, but I find that you learn so much about the story and the characters yourself as you go along that it's not good to overplot towards the end because hopefully you'll have discovered even better things along the way. They're thematically similar. Both of them deal with young people in violent situations. They're structurally quite similar. Each of the books has 27 chapters divided into 9 sections. And that probably comes from my playwriting background during a time in my life when I wrote 3-act plays, and that's a very comfortable structure for me to use. I think of each of those, at the end of each 9 chapters, there's a new part begins, and I actually still call each of those breaks act breaks, as you would in playwriting, because that's how I think of them.